Beep. Cool, so my name is Darcy Clarke, and today I'm going to talk about the future of CSS at TorontoJS. It'll all make sense, don't worry about it. I'm a developer, designer, speaker, entrepreneur, lots of things. I gave myself a bunch of these titles, just like everybody does, right? Right? Titles are all made up. I'm a human being. I've worked with a lot of different companies, big brands, agencies, startups here in Toronto. These are just a few of companies I've worked with and helped build experiences for. I run Node School Toronto, with a bunch of lovely developers here in Toronto. Who's been to Node School before? Yeah, it's awesome, right? We're learning some server-side JavaScript, which is really cool. If you want to go to nodeschool.io/Toronto, you can go check out some of the stuff we're doing, the mentors that are there. There's going to be some updates to that website, hopefully soon. So I have some expectations for this talk. Expectations are that you know something like HTML, CSS, a little bit of that. JavaScript, obviously, we're at TorontoJS, and you have some JavaScript experience. Also preprocessors and build tools, I'm pretty sure everybody's had experience with those things. So if you have that, you're in for a good time. If you don't have that, don't worry, I'll try to bring you up to speed. What we're gonna cover is a little bit of history about CSS, things like preprocessors, post-CSS, which is the new cool guy on the block, I guess. Some inline styles, the pros and cons to inline styles, and why the heck we want to use those. And the future. The future, right? Yeah, back to the future. Here we go. So I went to a performing arts high school and did a little bit of drama. So I'm going to do like 5 acts, kind of like a Shakespearean play. So this is like Act 1 of CSS, right? I'm going to try to be very entertaining. You guys can laugh at me all you want. I run around here up on stage. So this is the exposition. Cascading style sheets, Act 1. Here's a little history, right? So we all know CSS has been around for a while. The level 1 spec came around in 1996, and then things progressed from there. I've actually met and had drinks with Hakoon William Lee, like the guy who made CSS, or like made the spec, the original spec. Also have like a sweet selfie with Tim Berners-Lee. What up? Yeah. Pretty cool. Go check out my Instagram. I look like really scared taking the photo with him. I'm like, hey. But yeah, so like we sort of progressed, went through these different transitions and these different levels of specification. The W3C kept evolving, the spec, the CSS spec. And then level 4 was like, oh, am I going to ever like come out? And then Tab Atkins was like, there's no such thing as CSS4. And then, well, everything sort of got componentized, and now there's certain specs that have different levels, and essentially CSS3 was the last monolithic sort of spec, right? Recently, Jacob Thornton, everybody knows him potentially as fat. He's really skinny, which is completely blows your mind. He wrote or did this amazing talk called Cascading Shit Show. If you've ever seen Jacob Thornton talk, he's amazing. He just sort of like rambles like this, and he's like, like cool, I'm so cool, I made Bootstrap and everybody uses it. He actually did this amazing talk. I forget where the meetup group was, but essentially about the history of CSS and sort of the paths we turned. So I won't dive into any more of that, but if you want to check out a really in-depth history of why we are where we are today and why the CSS code looks the way it does, he's got a great talk on it. And I'll have these slides up later so you guys can just like click on that link. It's not very friendly. But CSS is awesome, right? Everybody loves this. There's like mugs with this on. CSS is awesome. Well, no, CSS sucks. CSS is the worst, right? This is why I'm speaking to a room of JavaScript developers, right? Like I'm not at like some design conference right now. Why does CSS suck? Well, no variables, asterisks. I know there's variables coming and whatever. Don't be like, Darcy, I've seen Wes Boss's sweet little code pen with variables. I've seen it too. They're around the corner. Don't worry about it. There's no functions, no dependency management, no like encapsulation. Like everything's global. Like, it's just nonsense, right? But CSS is a style sheet language, and it's used for describing presentation of a document and in a markup language. So there's two things there that I obviously bolded for emphasis, right? Style sheet language and markup language. CSS is not a programming language, people, right? And we have these expectations that it's like, well, it should have variables and functions. And so that's kind of where we get to Act 2. A number of years ago, we were like, oh, we really want to have these really cool things to like help us style our documents. And so we created build tools and preprocessors. And I thought when I got away from Java, I would stop doing like these pre-compilation steps. I thought it was like, oh, I'm done with this, you know? So this is the rising action, right? Is there any drama nerds out there like that are kind of following along with like the Shakespearean? Eventually somebody's gonna die and it's all gonna be tragic, right? So, and word of warning, CSS might be the thing that's going out. So we came up with all these preprocessors, less SAS, SCSS, stylus. There was libraries like Rework, Clay, Myth, like all this crap, right? And preprocessors, well, they gave us variables, functions, some level of extension and dependency management. Preprocessors suck too. Who likes preprocessors? Anybody? You all do. We all do. They fill a gap, right? There's a gap right now. And I'm going to show you that there's other options. So preprocessors suck because they're half-baked programming languages. They were like created by the CSS community, and they were like, oh, we really need these things. And they're like, let's make mix-ins. It's like, that looks like a function. Why don't you just use function? Why don't you use the word functions? Let's create these like hash tables. And it's like, okay, like an object, like you don't have to like go back to like crazy old school. You don't have to write a programming language. Like we're reinventing the wheel here. There's no standards among these. So SAS doesn't talk with less and less doesn't talk with stylus. There's no interoperability, right? So if Bootstrap chooses to use less, you can't, import it to your project that's using SAS, which sucks. And of course, it's fragmented the communities. So there's about 1,000 different plugins for like doing color manipulation in SAS versus less versus everything. So we're duplicating our efforts all over the place. So Act 2.5, kind of, conflict. The conflict, post-CSS, comes around and it's like, hey, I can like solve a lot of those problems. And it's like, I can basically allow you to communicate between all these different languages. And what post-CSS actually does is like stolen verbatim out of the GitHub. It essentially builds up an abstract syntax tree. So it decides, oh, let's build up this big JSON object that sort of takes away all the craziness and creates sort of a standard that everything gets parsed into. And then you can pass over some transformations or essentially some functions that can manipulate that syntax tree, right? So now, because there's a standard, you can do some cool stuff with it, right? So this is how you can sort of meld things together. Now, this is what a typical post-CSS usage looks like. So you can imagine I have like a gulp file. Most people have probably dealt with gulp or grunt. And I'm including gulp and post-CSS, and then I create a task, and then I have some transformations that I want to do, like adding, auto-prefixing or prefixing to my styles. And then there at the bottom is actually where I go and I say, find all my CSS files, do the transformations with post-CSS, and then generate a CSS file. So this is pretty standard. So the pre-CSS plugin is actually, I did some research and I went and looked at what the most popular plugins for post-CSS were. And it actually, pre-CSS is one of the most popular, and it allows you to do SAS-like syntax. So what we're looking at is not sort of a deviation away from the standard, but we're continuing to maintain these non-standard, half-baked programming languages, right? So we're not writing CSS anymore. We're writing pre-CSS markup, or we're writing SAS still, or we're writing less. Because what the post-CSS community has done is they've just created new functions and plugins to allow you to keep using the old crap you were using before. So we haven't gone anywhere, and this is why this is 0.5, and this is where the conflict comes. And my buddy Jeff over here is going to come and kick me in the butt soon, because he loves it. He likes post-CSS. So pre-CSS, here's an example of it, right? This looks exactly like SAS, right? It allows you to write SAS code. But what the heck is SAS code? It's a half-baked programming language, believe me. And Chris Epstein, who like wrote Sass, me and him go at it sometimes on Twitter. Good friend though. So the most popular packages in the post-CSS ecosystem are pre-CSS, post-CSS, SCSS, and auto prefixer. And all of these to me are kind of like, they're just allowing you to do the same thing that we've been doing for a number of years, and you're not actually evolving the ecosystem, right? We haven't changed the kind of code we're writing, and we're not creating some sort of standard, really. So there has to be a better way. And so I started to look a number of years ago. I was looking at this, and I've actually been thinking about this concept for a long time. I looked at like the CSS declaration, and I was like, okay, you've got like a block, and you've got some key value pairs, right? And I was like, this looks a lot like JavaScript. And so I was kind of like, maybe, maybe we could actually write this in JavaScript, in JSON syntax. But I also looked at some inconsistencies that we find in CSS. So if you've ever done any manipulation of styles in the browser, I'm sure you've interacted with the DOM, right? As JavaScript developers, I'm positive you've probably interacted with the DOM. And you'll notice that the actual way that you declare your styles in CSS is not how the DOM interprets it. So if you ever looked at an element style object, it's actually camel cased, right? So if we were to look at the style declaration object, which I think I have a version of this. So essentially what the browser does for us is it turns all the dash cased CSS rules into camel case, right? So if you want to do an animation or you want to do a manipulation of styles, you're already writing two sets of code, two different sets of code. So right there, Sass doesn't do this, Stylus doesn't do this, Less doesn't do this, PostCSS doesn't allow you to do this. You have to write two sets of code. So this is one inconsistency that we've maintained for a long time. And some like libraries like jQuery were like the first ones to sort of make a polyfill that allows us to write CSS syntax, but it actually gets transformed back into actual DOM manipulation, proper DOM APIs for you to manipulate the elements. So we're already living in a world where we're like having to write almost two sets of code, which is not cool. So CSS, again, it has no variables, but it's also not consistent, right? CSS sucks, and it's still sucking, and we're still shipping code that we essentially have to write two sets of it. There's no reusability. So that's one extra thing that CSS it's not consistent. So Brendan Eich, smart man he is, always bet on JavaScript, right? Oh yeah, JavaScript. That's why you're all here. So JavaScript has variables, it's got functions, not mixins, come on. It's been around for like 21 years, pretty standardized at this point. Interoperability, encapsulation, it's ubiquitous, it's consistent, it's amazing. JavaScript is the best. This is why I run Node School, you know, I'm pretty passionate about it. So this is what like your styles could be looking like, right? Creating your styles in JavaScript looks almost the exact same as if you were to write them in CSS, right? So here I've got a variable called styles, and I've just created essentially a key inside of that object called body. That's essentially my selector. And then inside of that, I've just got a whole bunch of key value pairs. It's beautiful, right? It looks almost the exact same. And you know what this is? This is consistent to the DOM API, right? So font, capital S size, that is consistent with what you'll find in JavaScript. Now, you might be thinking ahead a little, and you're like, I'm seeing what Darcy's putting down, right? I'm picking it up. So we might be able to actually share some of these objects with our single-page application code, with things like if you're using React styles, and you've seen that stuff. So this might be kind of cool, right? So JavaScript styles, Act 3, the climax, my favorite part. Anyways, let's dive in a little bit and actually see what this can look like and what's the benefits of actually writing our styles in JavaScript. Well, variables, this is how easy it can be, right? You all, if you know some JavaScript, you already know how to write your styles in JavaScript, right? You know what variables are, you know what functions are. Why the heck did we create these half-baked programming languages that have nuances, right? Sass and less and stylus, they all have nuances to how they parse essentially the syntax, which is not good because you want something consistent. Now imagine we have all the developer tools that all the JavaScript developers have, but now we have them for our styles. Syntax errors, all this stuff, JS length, hint, everything. Great, so this is how easy it can be. We say color, is EF, 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 which is like a really light gray if there's any like awesome designers out there that are just like parsing the hex codes and you're like, oh yeah. And then, okay, now I can use it inside my object. I can say color, font size, beautiful, but now we can do things like functions. I can create like a little % function, and we're just using JavaScript, right? There isn't some crazy mixing, like crazy architecture I have to learn or sort of language and syntax that I have to relearn. You already know a programming language that's ubiquitous in your code, right? Your build tools are all written in JavaScript. Your tests are written in JavaScript. Your single page applications are written in JavaScript. So why not your styles? So you can see I'm doing some cool stuff down at the bottom. I'm passing the % function, a font size, and then some other values. It's all pretty simple, right? But it gets even better, right? Modules, packages, NPM, right? Everybody knows NPM, right? I hope. That's why we're here. Ben's going to yell at you if you don't know NPM. And so we can now utilize the ecosystem of 250,000 packages on NPM inside of our code, right? And we can always actually modularize our own CSS as well, right? So we can say, I have a variables file, right? And now I'm just going to require that variables file. It's beautiful, right? You're just importing it. It just looks like if you've done any node programming or at all, it looks essentially like you're writing some server-side JavaScript, right? Which is kind of cool. So, I'm doing some imports of the, now I've moved my % function into sort of a units library, right? Kind of cool. And then if you really like ES6, now we've got ES6. We can utilize that. And now it's like beautiful. If you want imports instead of like require statements, it's like, ooh, pretty hot, right? It's awesome. This is awesome. And then here I am using like string concatenation, which is pretty sweet as well. All ES6 stuff. And if you like CoffeeScript like I used to, and now everybody's going to make fun of me, it looks like this. And now it looks just like Sass or Stylus, right? No semicolons, you don't like your block. This all parses down to JavaScript, by the way, if you've never seen CoffeeScript. Some people hate it. I used to love it. I guess I'm on the ES6 train now. So how do you do this today? How can you actually do the future of CSS or what I'm talking about today? Well, there's a project called JSS, JavaScript Style Sheets. It's essentially a thin layer that builds up, or essentially does like a toString on your object that you create, right? So you can imagine that you just require all your JavaScript styles, and it'll just basically take that and turn it into one big CSS style sheet that you can save to a file. And there's actually an integration with PostCSS. So if you are utilizing some of the nice to have latest greatest things like auto prefix or whatever, there is an integration with PostCSS. So all you have to do is require all your JavaScript styles, and then you can do some transformations on top of that, and you can save that again to a CSS file. Now that's kind of cool. And this is actually how you would do that. This is another like gulp file where I utilize postcss.js. So you can imagine that I go out and I do a task and I look for all my JavaScript files now, instead of CSS files, and I run the transformation over all those files with the postcss.js plugin, and then just output the what comes out afterwards. So quickly, if you came here and you were like, oh crap, like this description has like React in it, and everybody wants React programmers, I'm not going to really talk about React. I am going to give you a word of warning though. And this doesn't really come from me, it comes from my buddy Miko. Miko, can't say his last name, works at Jam3. So React has like this concept and has been sort of promoting the concept of inline styles or inline properties and styles. I just like grabbed this, again, the description of how they're utilizing inline styles right from the library. And an example of how that works is actually if you want to create like a React component, like a button component, you can create your styles object at the top, and then you just create it or add it as like essentially properties like you would anything else in React, like any other properties. So this essentially creates a button that looks like this. So you have inline styles, and who like remembers being like inline styles are not a good thing, like from 12 years ago, 15 years ago? Who's been, yeah, you're like, this looks like a step backwards, and it is. You want to know why? Well, this is a library also to do the same thing. It's a step backwards because the performance sucks when you try to animate this way, when you try to animate those properties. And you want to know why the performance sucks? It's because React is trying to do all this sort of diffing, right? So if you're trying to do like some sort of animation and you're tweening some sort of property, you don't need to have some sort of diffing going on between those properties because you know what the value should be. So Miko actually did this performance, did some analytics essentially, and figured out that the performance sucks. So it's way easier for you to be updating if you're using React or something like that, updating your styles when you're animating components with just actually updating the style object. So actually manipulating the element itself and not updating the properties in that component. So really smart dude. And so that's just a word of warning. He actually, the reason why I want to bring it up, he created a project called F1 that takes the concept of writing your styles in JavaScript one step further. And F1 is a library that allows you to be concerned almost primarily about state. And so you worry about transitioning to and from states. Everything's written in JavaScript. It's crazy. And him and the Jam3 folks actually built this project called Vikings. It was like Project Vikings. And it's like this ridiculously amazing, immersive experience, all utilizing the F1 library. I'll kind of show this quickly. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. Do I have sound by any chance? No? Okay. Don't worry about it. So it's like pretty sweet. Got this awesome preloader. Like we're back in the days of Flash and stuff. There's like all these amazing like animations. And all this is actually being run off of CSS that was written in JavaScript essentially. Like their styles were written in JavaScript. But the nice thing is that it's written in such a way that you have sort of these arbitrary states. And so you have like a transition to object that has, you know, like a top value and a left value and maybe a width and some other things. And they use that essentially as the styles properties to be transitioning to, because everything's controlled in JavaScript, right? There isn't any CSS animations here. And a big reason why is because they actually heavily use like things like WebGL. And so abstracting away essentially state has given them a lot of flexibility for like UI and crazy transitions, and it's awesome. Cool. So let's go back here. So Act 5. Well, every good like idea and concept and library has a great name, right? Right? It starts with a great name and a great logo, and then it gets popular, and then you're like, this is crap, but I promise you I have a great name for this. So I talked to Axel Rushmeyer. Does everybody know who this guy is? He likes to be called Dr. Axel Rushmeyer, so I have to correct myself. Very smart man, amazing JavaScript developer. He wrote a great post I think a number of years ago now, or about a year and a half ago, essentially about the word isomorphic JavaScript and how it's like,
your fourth tab is playing and it's playing off the speaker.
no way. Is that what that is? Let's just watch this dude. Whoa. Anyways. Oh, there's Node School. Look at this beautiful website. Woo, woo, woo. Look at that guy. So Dr. Axel Rushmeyer, I talked to him actually in December when I flew to Berlin to give a version of this talk. And we had a brief discussion about this blog post he wrote talking about when Node.js first came out and was getting popular, and we were talking about server-side rendering with HTML and how we thought React, you know, like obviously was creating this ecosystem where we could understand the state of our application by passing, you know, an object from the server side to the front end. And so he came up, I think, with the word global or universal JavaScript because he thought isomorphic was like too big of a word, and which is totally correct. But then I was like, okay, this is cool. Like I'm totally on it. Like isomorphic is too big, but I also thought like global or universal was like, I don't know, just like too like benign. It was too like vague, right? Who knows what we're talking about when we say that we're writing, let's say, global JavaScript or isomorphic JavaScript, right? If you say that. And what we're essentially getting is that we're running the same code on the server side as well as the front end. So I came up with something. I was like, Axel, you said something in this blog post and I thought it was awesome. And he's like, what was it? And I was like, well, it's just JavaScript. Like nobody knows what the heck we're talking about when we say global, universal, or let's say isomorphic. I was like, why don't we just say just JavaScript? Like, what's your stack? What's your tech stack? Well, it's just JavaScript. That's all it is. It's amazing. It's like magical, right? It sounds amazing. And it's simple. It's simple. It's just JavaScript. You got JavaScript on server side, front end, everywhere. And so it's all just JavaScript. TM. And so I created stickers, right? We created a logo and stickers, and JJ is now, you know, you can just be like JJ. And we're not talking about Jeff Jewis, who's sitting up at the front here. We're talking about, hi, everybody. We're talking about just JavaScript. And what does that mean? It means that JavaScript is now on our client-side applications. It's running on our server-side application and logic. It's running our templates, right? You've been doing that for years. Handlebars, mustache. You're like, our styles now can be written in just JavaScript. Our tests are written in JavaScript. What? It's JavaScript, right? So we're all in the right market, right? We're all like writing JavaScript right now. It's pretty smart. So essentially, the whole ecosystem can be just JavaScript. So now, if I've got enough time, I will actually show you some implementations, or essentially an easy way to write your styles in JavaScript. And I'll do a quick demo, depending on how much time I got. 5 minutes? Perfect. I think I can do it. I'm going to Paul Irish this. Yeah. You know what? Okay. Okay. Let's open some stuff. Cool. So I have, can I like boost this? Yeah. So essentially I just have a, this is going to be kind of hard to see. Can we turn off these lights by any chance? That'd be awesome for anybody. Or I could try to invert my color scheme here. All I've done quickly is essentially written a little build script. You can imagine that you would have, you know, this would be like npm scripts. You could run like this build task whenever you want, or you could write a gulp file again, or write a grunt task for yourself. And so all I've done is included a couple of libraries. This code's going to be run on the server side. You know, I got Lodash. I include my styles, and I want to show you actually what is in index.js. So if I look at the source, and I look in my styles folder, and I look at index.js, this is all that I'm including, right? I'm including like a reset, a body, a header, and I'm doing some exporting, right? So essentially what I showed you, we're basically writing JavaScript to write our styles. And this looks a lot like, you know, if you're requiring importing files with Sass or less or styles, except, you know, that this kind of code is all throughout your application already, I bet, right? So everything's looking the same. So let's look at something like, let's look at this variables file that I built, which is kind of cool. You'll notice I've actually included a third-party npm package here. I was like, npm installed this color plugin, which is like just simply a color manipulation plugin. I didn't have to go looking for a mix-in for Sass or a mix-in for Stylus or whatever the crap. There's a million, like a quarter of a million amazing packages out there that already have like tests and already have all this wonderful stuff. And you know what? It gives me the ability to like darken, to do like hex, to like return hex strings or return, oh, there's a space there. Hex strings or like HSLA or whatever I want. This is an amazing plugin, and it's already there, and I can utilize it both in my JavaScript code as well as in my CSS. So then I created like a base color object and some font size. This is really like simple, arbitrary stuff. You know, I've got essentially a reset that has like nothing in it. It's just like saying, you know, star selector, box sizing, border box. PS is, this is not the way that you do this. Does anybody know the way that you set border box? You always inherit from the parent. Did you know? Yeah, did you know? Were you going to say that? I owe you a cookie. Yeah, that's awesome. So you always inherit. That's always the best way. So then inside of, let's say, my header.js, which is like my header styles, I'm including that variables file, and then I can utilize it. So it can be like vars.baseColor. And like, this is awesome, right? It's all just JavaScript. Now, when I run, if we look back at that build process that I created, I'm utilizing post-CSS here to actually parse. So post-CSS with that post-CSS-JS transformation will allow me to basically figure out what the contents of that object and like turn it into that nice AST that we can then go off and do other great stuff with it if we wanted to. I'm doing something that's really like crappy right here. It's not in like a gulp task, so I actually have to write the files manually. So if you've ever seen Node, like this is, I'm using the native file system module to write, and I'm doing it synchronously, which is also a bad idea. So don't like hit me over the head with a hammer if you have noticed these things. So what happens when I actually run, let's say node build. So run that process, and let's go into, close my slides. Let's go into the build folder, and you'll see, whoop, wrong build folder, demo, build. So assets, I now have a CSS file and I have a JS file. So CSS file is essentially just everything compiled, right? As you would want, as you would expect from like Sass or Less or Stylus. So you can serve this up immediately. And of course you could like fragment this and put some like inline styles if you want, like the fastest time, paint time, or time to glass essentially. But then I also have this styles object. So if I open up this, it's got like a huge JavaScript object with the exact same information. Now this is the interesting part. Now I can pass this JavaScript file to, let's say, my JavaScript, my single page application, and to start to do some fun stuff with that. So if I open up index.html, you can see that I've actually console logged that object. And these are all my styles that are actually in the CSS that got generated, right? So utilizing the post-CSS -js library or the JSS project, which is JavaScript style sheets, you can actually do the pre-compilation. The really interesting part is that JSS actually works in the browser. So you can do manipulation of your styles inside of your single page application and then re-render your styles, which is really cool. And this is a little JSS has like on their GitHub page, they have a bunch of links to demos, and then also this playground where you can actually start to see what it looks like when you create just like arbitrary styles in JavaScript. And again, going back to what I was talking about with Miko and the team at Jam3 and what they did with for Vikings, you can see that you can create arbitrary selectors. So in this case, there's one called like loaded. And so you add the opacity 1. So you can imagine that your JavaScript application, your single page application, might want to use that, but it's completely, it'll get ignored and won't be necessary for your CSS. So this is a nice little playground. You can do some like fun stuff in here, like, you know, just see what it does when you do like background, image, URL, something, right? And it will give you URL is not defined because I need to do this. Awesome. So loaded objects. What are we doing here? Right. Okay. So yeah. So this is the loaded object gets parsed just as an object. It's going to get ignored by the CSS. But yeah, this is like a great example of like how you can like play around, see what this does. And then there's a number of awesome little examples of how some other things actually work in this library, like camel casing, vendor prefixing, and sorting properties, and all this other fun stuff. So again, that's, if I've got it open, GitHub, JSS, and then right down, they have actual links to online examples. And the cool thing, again, is that we can actually utilize or actually work with these objects in the browser, and this JSS library works both on the server side as well as in the browser. So yeah, I think if somebody, this is kind of like my last little thing, if somebody were to talk to you today or tonight or tomorrow and ask you, you know, what the heck was this crazy dude talking about at TorontoJS? And what's the future of CSS? You should say, it's JavaScript everywhere, right? Right? And then they can look kind of scared and you like reassure them. Like Buzz looks really confident there and I'm really confident. So I know you guys are a little scared, so don't worry about it. But essentially the future of CSS is actually JavaScript. So thank you so much. And let me know if you have any questions. That's it.